what you've got, talk through what's there. If you have something handwritten, you're going to give it to Andrew and he's going to make sure it gets typed up. If it's something that you don't think is typable, you may need to do a little more work.
And Andrew, we're messing.
So, sorry. Besides everything, Andrew, come on.
So we were brainstorming about cluster meetings, recognizing that what we're really doing is trying to put together something that can reflect kind of the board's interests, and that then it will necessitate a conversation, obviously, with PTA leadership, we're trying to capture. So we started, going back to kind of the why, and we said, there are two real things going on when we cross the threshold, basically, and go into the community. One is, it's an opportunity for us to be actually out in the community and not having people come to cover. But it's also an opportunity for us to connect to PTA leaders who do represent constituents. So we talked a lot about the fact that one of our key interests is to have the board take back responsibility for the community part of that. That if we're taking the time to go into the community, we really want to leverage the resources within MCPS to do very significant outreach. So we said we would want to reach out to the faith-based community, the Recreation Center, our nonprofit partners, immigrant communities, the NAACP Parent Council, neighborhood groups, parent groups. And we also said, once we sort of set the dates for our cluster meetings, we want to be intentional about publishing it to those students who aren't necessarily going to school in their neighborhoods, so students in alternative programs and special ed schools and various choice programs, so that if they want to come to a community piece that's where they live, that they would know that was open. And so we talked about extending the time for the community piece, so we're thinking maybe like an hour and a half. That we would, once the dates were set, right, because cluster meeting dates get set well in advance, one thing that would change is we'd have to actually fix the location. We typically left it to PTA to kind of decide at the last minute which school, but we'd have to pick a place if we're going to advertise it. And while we would have a snow date, we also wouldn't change it then, because this would also be our meeting out in the community. So thinking about that part. And that what we thought about was... thinking about the conversation we had earlier, sort of, push out and take in, that we might take the first 15 minutes to tailor some push out with things that might be relevant to a particular community. Like we get talking points before we go to clusters. So we would maybe be deliberate and think about what are some key messages for that community that we would open with. But then it would really be an hour and 15-minute opportunity to do some meeting, relationship building, and again, we take the onus off the PTA, but they, frankly, we hope, get a benefit, because if we do this well, and parents or community members come who haven't been before, they could be, tied then into the school PTA. There might be some mutual benefit. So that's one thing that we talked about. We also want to keep, though, the opportunity for meeting with PTA leadership and principals, because they obviously are engaged and have perspectives. But what we would really like to present to them is, we're really going to ask, completely respectfully, it not be so much the performances.
Let's just be honest. No more show and tell. No more show.
Okay, that's a separate piece. So we sometimes get musical performances or other things, which we'd love for them to invite us to in the year, and we'll certainly try to come. But we feel like this is different kind of valuable time in terms of really interacting. And the same way, sometimes we get a lot of presentations where people just share information about their school, which candidly we probably already had in the talking points. So we thought we could even start by having the board president acknowledge some of the accolades that we get in our talking points, to sort of give them the kudos and the recognition right up front, and then really save an hour for a real conversation about an issue that they get to choose. They get to decide what they want to interact with us about, but really use that. And what we would do is we would also promise them that we will find a way to kind of capture that feedback, because we haven't done that in a formal way. And that will have some staff implications. It could be the associate superintendent, it could be the director, or we may want to rethink that. But so the issues that come up get captured, and that we then bring them back through the board office to get dispersed. Not necessarily we're going to send you a response to this, but a way to know if you've shared it with us, it's getting back into the system in a sort of formal way. And then we thought we could even add to board meeting presentations, just like we do committees, that there would be specific cluster updates. So it's not like, do we happen to remember to mention, but that there would be, a set on the agenda in the cluster meeting season, which is usually the spring, cluster meeting update, where we would both recognize them, because we want to recognize clusters for the good things, mention some of the big themes that came up, and we would, have that now be a structured way for all the cluster meetings, so there would be some consistency, there would be some recognition, they'd know that we were listening and participating, and so that would be a piece of it. We thought about how this might, thinking about sort of joint efforts, right? I mean, the superintendent is doing these community days, and we thought maybe we could try for the first year to have one cluster meeting and community day overlap, and maybe have the evening segment be this new structure, because you are having dedicated time with PTA leadership for sort of an hour. And then if our staff is putting in all this time to do the outreach, you have a more open community meeting. It just might not have the pass the microphone around. So we're just suggesting that's a place to think about whether we want to try and overlap and see if that sort of suits mutual interest or not, but we thought we'd try that. And then the only piece that we thought we would add, but we're being mindful of time and everybody's time together, we talked about the fact that PTA organization has switched to level alike, and that there might be value in moving to level alike, but if you just added those on to cluster visits, if you have 4 elementary associate suits, 1 middle and 1 high school, that's 6 more meetings, which would be challenging. So we thought, let's try, we propose doing one. Let's do a middle school level alike PTA meeting to see what that feels like, different from a cluster PTA meeting. It's obviously, you're not getting sort of the articulation of community issues, but you may be getting curriculum or other kinds of issues, and then see how that goes and see if we like it better. We'd have to then figure out a time balance, but seemed like it would be worth a try. So that's our proposal.
So,
Oh, there's work for everybody.
Yeah.
So, some of it is, board office is clearly going to have a little bit more. Tim's shop is clearly going to have, the outreach part if we're going to try to do that right. I don't quite know how to, define it beyond that.
Yeah, well, so there needs to be a belly button.
Okay.
That makes the one to make sure that.
Well, see, this one's a little weird because we do have to first sit down with PTA leadership.
Got it.
So
My concern is that.
Yep.
Set
So-
that up, follow on.
Well, I guess board officers have to first sit down with PTA leadership, so maybe it's their belly buttons initially, and then we have to figure it out.
Well, and just so, the other piece is, we're going to be shifting how we do community days next year, and all that, so before you have a conversation with PTA leadership, I think it's important to know what it is that you're planning on next year. If there's any, based on the last time we said, in terms of
I mean, we're putting it out to everybody.
leveraging some of the work that we've been doing.
So, because of the scheduling issue, which is not insignificant, right, that customer, so when will you have some closure on what you're thinking is, so that you can go ahead and give them something? This is it, then this has been a problem. I'm trying to follow up on.
Yeah, okay, I mean, and that's why.
So what's the date certain that you'll have some closure for?
Well, it's interesting because and this is where I think, and I said in the very initial planning of this, when we first sat down with board officers, I think the rubber really hits the road when we leave the meeting and start taking all of what we've done today and put it into action steps. And we haven't actually mapped out the calendar, the schedule, because we were waiting for this conversation to take place. And so I think that I'm trying to
chicken egg issue.
Yeah, well, I think with this one specifically, because I think possibly with each one, we're going to want to consider what those common organizational resources are that we leverage together in service of the greater good. So I think it makes sense to understand when, do we pick the schedule of the cluster meetings
It's already up.
is up, right? So I think let's take that as a first step, and then we can look and see when they're scheduled, where they're scheduled, and look for alignment.
I mean, if my colleagues here, if this sounds good to people, if there's some consensus that we want to propose this, I feel like board officers probably need to meet with Mrs. PTA leadership quickly, right? That's the first piece, just on this. And then as to whether it, replaces a community day or how the community days change, that we have time, I think, to talk about internally. Although, if our dates are fixed, then
Well,
the board calendar for the 2014-15 school year begins July 1, it's already up. But the cluster meetings generally start in February. So it would seem to me that the conversation, if there's going to be any kind of changes, modifications, we want to certainly have a discussion with NCCBTA, you know, that sooner than later.
Right.
And I'm gonna go back to my champion question. I understand that there are different players and it has to be coordinated with PTA. But someone in here, or maybe it's two someones, needs to be, they're not gonna be the ones doing all the work, but needs to be the one that takes the ownership of it, to say, these were the actions, how we set up the actions.
Can I go back and say, is there an agreement, is there consensus on this proposal? Or is there a step that has to happen before that to see that there is,
What a board member
there's
said.
something to champion?
No, I mean,
Okay.
I think it's worth it to try at the cluster meetings, because I think board members have felt frustration about how the cluster meetings, some of them have happened. I also think that we ought to try the level of light, and, you know, that had been one of my thoughts, that in, possibly in lieu of cluster meetings, that I think we need to be in a transition and alert NCCPTA that, you know, we're thinking about moving that direction possibly in the future. So I think it would be worthwhile to try, you know, one level alike. You know.
So as far as,
Who owns it?
well, I mean, and it's not, so again, I understand there may be formality as to a formal adoption of, are you gonna move forward with this? My main concern is that we leave here, you've done all this great work, and if nobody feels like they need to follow up, either A, to get approval, or B, to get things coordinated, it's gonna fall out of the wayside. So
I think the board office has to schedule the officers, one, to meet with NCCPTA, and two, to schedule a middle school level of like meeting.
But who's gonna actually make sure that that piece of paper, I mean, I know Andy is going to type up what's on there, but if there's not enough details, it's the follow through of making sure the details are on there so that you're ready to meet and and the people that need to be coordinated with.
That's really a board office function.
Okay.
In terms of scheduling meetings for board members and making sure that they have the appropriate materials necessary, so.
And if board officers are talking on CPT leadership, to the extent there are adjustments and tweaks, they're going to be the ones who can work with
And
the board
I would
office.
suggest that Shirley, as the spokesman for the cluster meeting when you visited conversation, also be part of this conversation.
Well done.
Right.
Well done.
Other board members' reactions, feedback, does it sound like a good idea, things you're worried about?
I would just wonder about two pieces, or add two pieces, in terms of pre-work. One is, what data does the board need about the cluster you're going into? And what can we do to help you with that? Is there some kind of standard? board? No, I'm not talking about talking points. I'm talking, just, I'm not talking talking points. I
Well,
mean,
the talking points aren't talking points. Talking points are the briefing packet, so they get sort of,
It's updated on capital needs, it's challenges that are going on, recognitions.
so it's a full sort of briefing to give them.
All right, maybe I just need to think about that and see what other might work. The other thing, and maybe this was mentioned, I just wanted to miss it, but I did something this year, one of my community days, that was very effective. We asked Impact Silver Spring, we asked Ronnie to organize a group that I met with during lunch. He pulled it together, facilitated the meeting, and it was a way to go to get a different kind of conversation as part of my community day, so it wasn't just schools and all that, but partnering with other as you think about cluster meetings, partnering with other parts of the community that also have involvement in that, in that part of the community could help get other people out and could make it a larger thing. And I found it, again, to be a really powerful part of the community data doing the DCC this year. There are others who are really willing to help, you know, and obviously we have the usual suspects, but as we think about planning of those cluster meetings, the element is adding to that can help. So that you're not doing everything where you leverage some of the resources of the people who really want to do some of the work there. And who have some connection with others, but not just to add as an idea. Again, I found it very powerful and will replicate it.
Hiring on the plan, who decides the location?
Well, you typically go to a school in a cluster.
Well, they thinks they may decide to show up a school that's falling apart versus that's happening at the high school because that's the biggest location. I'm just saying, if we're going to this model, I mean, do they decide, do we decide? I mean,
Well, that's probably the conversation you have to have with them.
Right, I mean,
Right.
there's I think an elevated interest on accessibility if you're gonna open it up to the community. You know, and again, if you're having, I think it's give and take. You know, some balancing of something they feel like they really want us to see. You know, if it's relatively accessible, great, we can definitely defer to them, but being mindful of the fact that we're also trying to accomplish this opening up to the community. I think, right? Other folks?
I think it should remain a choice. I think the issue is we may start saying it has to be able to accommodate X size. And then they can choose, you know. And I think if we are able to do this model and know that we can do that first community meeting, we know that's a 20, 30, 40 person meeting, we just say to them that wherever you choose has to accommodate at least that.
Well, I mean, every school, I mean, our elementaries have an all-purpose. So if you're talking about a bigger crowd, can always be accommodated in an all-purpose room. As a cluster coordinator who organized 2 of these, you know, one year, the one time I organized it, it was because there was an elementary that we really wanted to communicate to the board the desperate need for modernization. And then the other time, we did it at the high school because, you know, we have a different agenda, so to speak. So I think it should be the PTA, you know, in conjunction with the board, you know, but I think that we ought to leave that a little bit flexible because, you know, every community, you know, Seneca Valley wanted us to see the leaky roof and the trash cans, you know, catching the leaks. So, I mean, I think it has to, I think we work with them, but, you know,
This is certainly enough to break the FCCPT.
I wanted to make sure that they have enough time to talk about other facilities, because you know, it always talks about the refrigerator that doesn't work, or the lights that are out. Will there be time built in so that they can talk about some of those issues? Oh, they need a bigger building.
So I mean, our proposal was that the PTA leadership were going to decide what issues they want to focus on. The capital issues are their biggest issues. We're more than happy to still talk about that. You know, we're still planning an hour of time, and if it's without kind of presentations and not, you know, saying what the schools do, that should be.
So they can talk about whatever they want.
Yeah. So can I just piggyback on what Josh said, because, you know, we did talk about not the outreach to some of the partners is, as you said, it's not just to help the people, but it is to actually ask them to maybe bring some people. People might definitely feel more comfortable if somebody from, you know, their church or their parent group or their sort of group were coming with them. So absolutely thinking about that. But, you know, again, I feel like some of those details we can get good guidance from Tim and Tim Shop about it.
So what other question I would have for the board as you're talking about this with FCCPTA? I understand that capital issues play into this, but I don't know that the board's interest is in, that the board, you know, finds the most value. It's the most valuable for the board to have people talking about capital issues that you already know about. as I hear the board talking, I hear you guys talking about the want to connect with the community more broadly and deeply, broadly in the sense of more people that voices deeply in the sense of really understand the issues that affect kids and families and how you can affect that. And I just wonder if you want to talk with the PTA about that. It's not that we don't want to get, but you guys know where the leaky roofs are, right? You know where the issues are. Is it the best use of everybody's time to go over that? I just don't know. So you just don't want to talk about that.
Well, no, but I'm not saying we want to talk about that, but we structure it to the point where they can't. They're not gonna like that either.
Well, that's right. That's right. So that's the conversation though I think you got to have with them. You don't want to dismiss it, right? You don't want because you don't want them to feel that way, but at the same time, you want to use that way to really understand what are the issues around kids, right, and families in the community. What's that?
We should give them that suggestion, that's, I mean, you know, they have the opportunity to testify every year during the CIP process and through the summer facility comments, and that, you know, this is a time to exchange ideas with the board, share concern, you know, but there are regular structured opportunities on
It's worth
Well,
talking.
they do that now.
Right.
So it sounds like it's a kind of a give and take conversation with PTA. Sounds like you have enough information that you can at least type it up, probably a board plan, even if there's not necessarily a solid drive to closure.
I
But you guys
would
figure that out.
support the forward planning on this piece because I think there's a joint effort around it and that I'm happy to do that. I think as we go deeper, we've only tackled 4 today. We're going to have a future conversation around, I mean, we're going to have a big plan, right? And then there's going to be, project planning for each piece of this. And I think one of the questions that we have to really attend to is, so who's writing the project plan, right? Who's making sure that it gets monitored, that deadlines get hit, deliverables are
Resources get allocated.
exactly. And so I think that there's subject matter expertise that we have in our communications department, in our engagement department. I think we have relationships and connections and all of that. But the question is around that, like who's driving it to closure? That question I think is really, really critical. So I mean, for this one, you said Brandon is going to, I think, drive it to closure. But you know, and that may be that we write it up that way in the plan that that's the sponsor who can be, you know, because this is a huge item off of the plan. So it's just something, and I don't know, I don't have the answer for it, but you know, I just want to.
So,
yeah.
I think I'd like to sort of test the house and see if we could put another car on our parking lot and get sort of tested. I've been thinking about it for the last 15, 20 minutes. We are talking about the first 4 of these strategic actions. There are so many more we've got to get to. At the bottom of all of these is going to be a question about resources to carry out the work. And the pattern here has been that when we do engagement of almost any sort, one of the primary places we go is to the Office of Community Engagement and Partnership to do many of those tasks. I'm not sure we've got the resources to do all that. And I'm also not sure whether all of this work is our work. And so that's a discussion we're going to need to have, because I feel a need to sort of draw a circle around the deeper work that we need to do, and all of this is not going to be there.
So the parking lot item is kind of resource
Resources.
alignment?
It's resource.
Structures, resources.
It's a serious concern.
And I understand this first one's a little more complex because it's a balance of working with an outside group. But I mean, my goal would be that, you know, what you got on paper were the initial thoughts it does get put into kind of some sort of documentation that could be shared with the right groups internally, and then also worked with the PTA. And then if the PTA agrees, you are gonna have to get to the level of roles and responsibilities, who's doing what, and then the alignment of resources. So, that's an element that's gonna have to happen to make sure that the plan gets fleshed out. And that's the only reason why I just was looking for who kind of was gonna take it to that next step, to make sure that it keeps moving, or it reaches a decision where you say, too hard, can't do it, they're not gonna change, end it. Okay, any other questions around
I just want to make sure that there's a consensus of the group, that we talked about a lot of different things. So is it the consensus of the group that there's going to be a meeting with MCCPTA to kind of discuss these items? And is there also consensus around scheduling a middle school level like meeting, and gradually kind of after the PTA meeting, kind of phasing in whatever that new model of cluster meetings looks like? Again, just checking to make sure that everyone's on the same page and in agreement about what's going to happen.
I am, except I thought the level of like meeting was just gonna be one meeting to see if you liked it, that we're not necessarily raising our hand right now that we are looking to move to that direction.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Okay.
Because we just don't know
Right.
what kind of information, would it be productive?
Right.
We thought we would try.
Yeah, which I'm all for, I support that, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't.
And that was the middle school.
Yeah.
I'm just asking.
I mean, I think we would suggest either middle school, because those are single ones, right? At the elementary, we got 4, so, if there's a reason, again, that staff would say high school was better aligned with some things they're working on, or middle school is better. I think we were just suggesting we experiment with one, and the middle or the high school might be easier because there is just one.
And I think you gotta talk to the PTA.
So I just want to make sure I'm clear, are you talking to PTA or?
No, board officers,
It's sure.
are happy to come along. I'll get in touch.
Good, got it.
Okay.
Right, so, I'm sorry, so potentially, if the PTA is, likes it, it's a go, if they say, bad, we don't like it, but there's no consensus around it, then is it cluster meetings as usual this year, or is it a reconvening?
I mean, you just don't show up for questions.
Or we don't want to even go there?
Well, we're not eliminating the cluster
No, I
meetings.
understand, but, no, I
We're
just.
talking about how those actual meetings are reorganized.
No.
We don't like that idea. I guess what I'm saying is then it's possible that in this meeting we can have that there may be yet
A counter proposal?
a counter
So-
some variation of it.
So one thing that MCPS does really well is have interest-based stance. And if the conversation is an interest-based one about the desire to connect in communities with amongst leaders, you gotta be able to come to something that may not look exactly like this, but will be an approximation.
I think what I was hearing loud and clear is that board members are going to the cluster meetings and they're getting in their car and driving away going, we perhaps just squandered a really important opportunity to connect on a deep level with this community. And so I think what was exciting to me about being in this group is it met a cluster meeting need, but it also sort of combined the where they are meetings with the bringing more people. It hit several of these values that people raise, so.
So, I mean, my suggestion would be that when you go, whoever goes and talks to the PTA expresses that the reasoning behind why you are looking to change it, and that you want to work collaboratively, and certainly there may be some give and take because of where their stance is. So it'll be, obviously you guys have a lot of fun out there, but.
Even within the PTA, if we meet with PTA, MCCPTA president, for them to be dictating to the cluster coordinators, this is the way meetings will occur when it's in your clusters, is even a different conversation. I mean, we did communicate with them last year, like, appreciated it because they said they'd never heard that before from the board, that kind of feedback, and that they did have those communications, and probably 4 of the clusters listened, and 2 of the clusters still did the old-fashioned approach. So I think that still is, up the air in terms of how that's going to work on there.
Just to be mindful, the board does have an annual meeting with NCCPTA in October, so that's also another opportunity to kind of reach out to the cluster coordinators that you find, depending on the outcome of the meeting, the officers meeting.
Okay, any other comments or questions or formality voting approval thingies? I was like, I thought that was a meeting. Okay. So moving on to our next one. Let's go ahead and talk about,
Yep.
we're gonna go to the where they are meetings.
So, in terms of our values and stakeholders, the values were aligned with 3 of the ones that we identified earlier: opportunity to share ideas and input, and informing decision making. Question about how do I help my child, and the third question about how individual schools meeting the needs of children and how we're being responsive. But also in this is the value of equity. Are we hearing equitably from all sectors of the community, and are we providing input in an equitable way to all sectors of the community? So our stakeholders are disengaged families, disengaged youth, disengaged community stakeholders from whom we don't normally hear. In terms of outcomes, we want to be able to receive feedback from them, so do some deep listening to hear from them in a direct and unintimidating way. But we also want to provide them with information on how they connect with resources, particularly at the local school. We want to give them access to district leaders in that same non-threatening environment. And we also want to go about the task of identifying who the local mayors are, right? Who are the people, who when they speak, everybody turns their head and listens to see whether there's some leverage we can get there and whether we can identify people who we might want to help develop to do some of that work. And to be able to capture momentum and excitement about connecting to school. Some of the places we thought, the venues, would be, we talked about bus stops a bit, but maybe in a health and human services service line, at grocery stores, I think, and otherwise, maybe at a day labor center, at houses of worship, homeless shelters, HOC sites. We identified the National Center of Children and Families with Steve's Whitman. David Skull development down in Rockville. Lots and lots of large garden apartment complexes all over our county. And faith communities we talked about a bit. So the resources we thought we would need would be translators, something to hand to people in terms of information about who the local leaders they can connect with that local school will be. Maybe some of the things that are happening at local school that might apply to them. Principals who are already engaged in this work. And the idea here would be to also have a group of family-facing resources specific to that neighborhood. When I say family-facing resources, I'm talking about parent communicators and OCEP, and ESOL, talking about PPW, we're talking about counselors, talking about folks from early childhood and perhaps Title I, to help drive the process so that they are present talking with people there so that the relationships are being built. But also so that board members and superintendent can plug in when their schedules allow. So we haven't come up with the frequency of how often we do this event, but we did want to segregate it from the demand of all of these crazy schedules we keep. In terms of content, we thought it would be about a 1-hour meeting, generally standing up depending on where we are.
We have this written information that we can hand to people. We would also get contact information from people for a couple of reasons. One, we want to be able to loop back from the questions they give us, to be back in direct contact with them. But also we want to begin to build a database of people who we can develop as leaders, help us continue our engagement work in a deeper way. And then the third thing is that we want to, and this is where we want to spend most of our time, is listening deeply to them. What are the challenges? What are the roadblocks? What are the barriers they find to being more engaged in school? And we want to get there with the message of not that we are there to help, and not that we're there to give them services or things, but with the message that we're there because they are an important partner with us in their child's education, and we value them as fond of knowledge about their children's education. In terms of resources, what we need to help us done, we thought we certainly need to have lots of conversations with the leaders of our family-facing resources. Again, we're talking about ESOL, PPWs, early childhood counselors, right down the line. Certainly we have to have a bunch of conversations with the principals to talk about how we want to do this and to figure out what they're already doing at school. Also with the PTA, FCC PTA. And also, eventually, our interagency partnerships. So we're now talking about Kennedy Cluster, Olympic Learning, Excel Beyond the Bell, those folks who may also be able to inform us about leaders that they know and about services that are being provided there. And the underlying question around this is how do we support what's already happening at local schools? We need to figure out what's going on there through these conversations and then connect this work with what's already going on there. We thought we could probably get something started October-ish. And our frequency is yet unclear. We need to discern that as we continue some conversation. So there you have it.
I have one question. Yeah, so I'm going to assume that some of our disengaged families are working for.
Yeah.
Have you thought at all about tapping into where they're working, right? And leverage some or ask for support from some of those institutions. So I don't know where
So
it is.
we sort of got at this.
Yeah, Walmart, whatever, maybe to say, hey, we want to do this, but you know what? We want to go to for an hour at lunch, but it's got to be a paid hour, and leverage that in some ways, because that's another place where people are. It could be before or after, or something like that, where the business actually would take responsibility to pay the hour, right? Where we're engaged. So just another.
It's a great idea. Our list is not exhaustive.
Place where people are.
We did that at one, the family and community at one time up at Walmart in Germantown at lunchtime, because they did like a parent academy. I don't know how it actually worked, but they did. Because in fact we honored Walmart for their partnership with us, because they have a lot of their employees are MCPS parents.
Yeah. So just another place where people are.
And this list isn't exhaustive, right? So I think our tilt to that was the big labor center, but it's the same kind of belief. But I think that's just another.
So I have a question. Tim, you were saying that board member superintendent would be invited to come. So who's expected to come? Who's going to do these?
So the way we were talking about it, the core team would be this group of local school leaders, particularly around the family-facing resources and central office that support them. So it would be a parent community coordinator from our shop, a parent community coordinator from ESOL, maybe a PPW from the local school that's attached to that neighborhood, to be the core team. And that would leave board members and the superintendent to come when they could, right? So you all would get to determine how often you want to come and do the work.
So there'd be work done in advance to produce whatever it was that they were gonna hand out.
Absolutely.
So the list of resources they would have.
Absolutely.
They would go and maybe have a translator, they would be the team of people to be available at whatever it was. We could come and provide, additional support or be there.
Exactly.
We'd have to meet with the outreach people with the principals beforehand, present the students see if this is something that you could be working with.
Just on that, and so I think that one of the things that we said earlier is that the different parts of the community need to know how much we value them, right? And so I think it needs to go beyond invitation and actual coordination of message, because coordination of schedule, right? Because when board members are there as part of the team, or the superintendent, or deputy superintendent, you know, whatever, and there as part of it, it shows, it communicates the value that we place on listening to and engaging with. In the same way, you have a calendar of cluster meetings because you value the PTA, and we calendar these other events and organize around that because you value hearing from folks who aren't always involved in the conversation, right? So I think that message is an important one. That's what I'm hearing in your comment and in relation there. So
I'm a firm believer that both budget and calendar are key indicators of priority.
right.
Having said that, I also know